Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Creative Piecemeal, a creative arts podcast. Today, I am really excited to have with me one of my former classmates and a poet and author, Keith Mark Gaboury. He earned his M.F.A. in creative writing from Emerson College, and his poems have appeared in such literary publications as Poetry Quarterly and New Millennium Writings, along with chapbooks from Duck Lake Books and the Pedestrian Press. He has a forthcoming chapbook from Finishing Line Press coming up, and he currently lives in California. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's been a long time since our humble days in undergrad.
Certainly. Yeah. I never want to forget about my roots and kind of where it all started for me.
Yeah, I remember you had such wonderful poems even back then, and you've really grown as a poet and author. Can you tell us a little bit more about your current projects and your upcoming chapbook?
I guess I'm in a bit of a transitional phase because earlier this month, I finished revising this full-length poetry collection. It's titled Still Human, and I've had individual poems published in various literary publications over the past 4 or 5 years, and it's a collection of surreal poems that focus on the human body through perspectives on gender and sexuality, human reproduction, and yeah, I enjoy writing surreal poetry, and I can have a lot of fun with playing with gender and flipping the pronouns, and I would put a male head on a female body or the other way around. I can create my own rules in that way, and so I'm looking for a publisher for that. And right now I would say I'm focusing on revising a couple new chapbooks that, some of the poems I wrote 9-10 years ago, but I'm trying to compile them into chapbooks. And one of them is around nature and environmental poems, which that's a theme I've returned to. And another one is around like realistic East Bay, San Francisco poems, and that deal with poverty or homelessness or economic inequality, and some of them kind of are, I would say, covering this similar terrain that the surreal collection focuses on. But in the surreal collection, obviously it's looking at the world through more of a disjointed lens, and in these poems I'm trying to take more of a grounded, realistic view. And and then I was excited that I have a collection, a chapbook coming out sometime next year from Finishing Line Press, which were actually poems that I started writing with Marty Mahaly back at Baker University, and then I kind of dug them up and kind of polished them off, and then wrote some new ones to round out the chapbook. Yeah, so that was kind of special for me, that I kind of took out the gold from poems I was initially working on, like 15 years ago. So
what I've always really loved about your work is that not only is it varied, but they always hit home. Like they're varied and they're cerebral, but there's always such a great heart to it. Like you just dig right deep to a certain emotion, and it just leaves you breathless when you read it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's what I definitely hope to achieve. And yeah, I mean, like with surreal poetry, I enjoy having a lot of fun with gender and sexuality and such. But yeah, at the end of the day, like every poem should have a heart within it, and there should be a purpose for every poetic decision made. I mean, a poem is ultimately just a series of decisions made by the poet for like word choice and line breaks and syntax and everything. It all, and when a poem is successful, all those individual choices come together. And yeah, and to have a heart in the middle of the poem is I strive for every time I write a poem.
It's almost like an award-winning recipe, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And the all the ingredients, need to come together in the right way. But I mean, it certainly doesn't always happen for me initially in a first draft. And I've been writing and revising that surreal collection I mean, not exclusively, but for about 5 years, because I would revise it and I had it in workshops, and it just took a long time to to get it to the place I wanted to. And it was and revision can be tricky because I can look at a poem one day and it seems like it's done, and then I'll look at it a week later and then I'll see like, oh, this isn't right and I need to like move all this stuff around. So I think I always come to realize that if I think a poem or a collection is complete, I'll set it aside and not look or really try to think about it for at least a week, and then I'll come back to it, and then I'll think, do I still have that same sentiment that it's complete? Because oftentimes I'll come back to it and I'm like, no, it's not. It's actually not.
It sounds like a lot of writers and authors and poets do that. They set their work aside and sort of let it marinate for a while and come back to it. And I think that's a really important step in the creative process, to make sure that you're happy as an artist with the way things are portrayed, and that the way you're creatively expressing yourself, and you're like 100% like, this is what I want, like every comma, everything is exactly what I want.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, ultimately, like a poem is a small reflection of me and who I am. Even with like persona poetry, when I'm writing in the voice of someone else, a poem, like when you have a poem published, you're going to have your name next to it. So I want it to represent me to the best of my ability. And so yeah, so that's why I believe in writing and revising more if needed. Yeah, it's very rare for me to get a poem completely finished the way I want it the first time. It's yeah, so I go to a lot of workshops and all that to get outside eyes on a poem I wrote, and then I'll go back and work on it some more. So
I've just been very curious whenever I talk to artists on the show, how the current situation with the pandemic has affected your creative process. Like, do you find that you suddenly have more time and you're able to focus on your art? Or do you feel like the world is chaotic and it's more distracting? Or is it becoming more influential on the art that you create?
I mean, I have a fairly busy Zoom schedule with, so I have to keep things organized with my Google Calendar for like, what I have events for on Zoom. And yeah, and I mean, there's definitely no travel time now, and it's opened up a lot of possibilities where geography isn't an issue. So I've become acquainted with poets from Portland, Oregon, or Canada, or New York State. That's really been great. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've had more or less time. I think I've had I make the time that I need to make in order to get the poems to where I want them to be. It's all about if there's the desire, there's the way to, make it happen.
Of course, yeah. I mean, when you're dedicated and you have a passion for something, it seems like there's all the time in the world. Like there's always going to be time, you know.
Definitely.
For people who are familiar with your work, is there something about your work that they wouldn't know? Like something that might surprise them?
I mean, there are some poems that it's taken me about 4 or 5 years to, finally get right, to where like it's one of those things where, uh, I knew it was that I had the right ending to a poem when I finally put it together, but I didn't know the right ending until it sort of clicked in my head. Like I have a poem in my chapbook, "Hello, Universe Lovers," where it's towards the end. It's called Moon Trash, and it's about all the artifacts that we've left on the moon from like the Apollo missions, and since then. It's kind of like a speculative poem about a garbage man going to the moon and collecting this, quote unquote trash, and throwing it away because the word trash is relative to who is assigning the objects as trash in the first place. But yeah, the ending to that poem was tricky for me. So, and it but then when it sort of clicked in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, I knew, like it really seemed obvious all along. But I tried like 3 or 4 different endings. So like, sometimes with poetry, it can, it can take multiple years for it to come together, all those one cohesive whole.
I think that definitely surprises me. I mean, I know many people are familiar with the fact that books take a long time and movies take a long time, but I think people underestimate how difficult it is to write poetry and get it the way you want it, and that it does take a long time. Kind of like fine wine. It has to age.
Well, and it can be deceiving, because obviously compared to a novel, there's just inherently less words in a poem. So when you read it and it's all maybe just on one piece of paper, and then maybe you can read the poem in a minute or two, then it seems relatively simple to write, because if you're only if it takes you 2 minutes to read, you're like, oh, this seems simple enough to write, but yeah, but just because it has less words than a novel doesn't mean that it's inherently simpler to write.
When did you first become passionate about creative writing and decided that you wanted to become a poet?
I first got interested in high school. I remember I took like an introduction to creative writing class, and I was on the staff of my literary magazine at Olathe North High School. It was called Mindburst, and that was a great community that I was a part of. I remember, yeah, like I wrote some poems when I was a junior and senior in high school, and yeah, I was just thinking about kind of what I kind of see as the first like poem I wrote. I remember it was called Expired Imagination. I just remember seeing a house when I was on the school bus, and it was just a really worn down house with like paint peeling, and then there was just like a doll in the front yard, and it was a kind of this dirty doll, kind of looked discarded, and so I was just struck by that image. And then in first period history, I believe, yeah, I tried to write a poem really quickly before class started, and after I wrote it, it felt like a real poem to me. And then from there, but when I went to Baker University, I think that's when I really got more serious about it. And definitely I had a lot of supportive teachers along the way. I don't I think, yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't call out all the people who supported me. And it's definitely about having that support system and community to help a poet along the way. Marty Mahaly was just a huge person for me at Baker. She just really helped me in so many different ways, and she's I believe she still is, yeah, like the only like creative writing professor at Baker. I took a lot of classes from her. I went to San Francisco State University, and if I did an M.A. in English with a concentration in creative writing. And I remember I took a persona poetry class where, because up until that point, I think I was basically just writing about myself and my family. But then in the persona poetry, a poet can inhabit another voice, which I just thought was like revolutionary. And the professor, Camille Dungy, she's currently teaching at Colorado State University now, but I mean, she's a great poet as well. I like highly recommend her work. And yeah, so that was like kind of an eye opener for me. And then I went to Emerson College too. So I remember taking like prose poetry class from Peter Shippey. That was great. And so I've written prose poetry too. So poetry isn't ultimately one thing, like you can write a poem in a form like a villanelle or a pantoum. You can write a poem in free verse. You can write a prose poem. The poetry is many things, so I enjoy that.
Yeah, I remember Marty, and I'm glad to hear that sounds like she had a great influence on you. She was very influential to me too. I think everyone that took our classes. So.
No, definitely. And actually, I want to reach out to her. I would like she could write possibly a blurb for my chapbook, because I initially wrote kind of drafts of those poems with her when I was at Baker. And I'd like to send her the chapbook.
It sounds like chapbooks and poetry have sort of been on the rise, especially with the younger generations, people in their 20s and people in college. And I'm just curious, you go to Target, you go to the store, and you see more poetry now on the bookshelves than before. I was wondering what your thoughts are about, I guess, a little more of a popular boom with artists such as Amanda Lovelace or Rupi Kaur or Atticus or people like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think chapbooks are as valid and acceptable compared to, full-length collections. They're just shorter, but that doesn't mean they're any less, lower in quality. And, they could be more appealing to compared to a full-length collection, because sometimes I've read some full-length collections that can kind of wear out their welcome to a certain degree, where it can, they're 100 pages plus. After a certain while, you're like, okay, like it's just a bit much. And so yeah, but with a chapbook, if it's between 15 to 30 pages, you could probably even read that in one sitting or a couple sittings. So it's smaller doses, but can definitely pack a lot of punch. And yeah, and I mean, I've had 2 chapbooks so far, and the new one coming out, but it's kind of definitely at the beginning stage of the publication process. But yeah, I'm all for chapbooks. I took a chapbook class actually a couple of years ago with Paul Corman Roberts at the San Francisco Creative Writing Institute, and which is now online too, so anyone can take classes with them. And yeah, and there's so many different types of chapbooks out there, and I remember he had all these different types of examples, and he laid them out on the table. And so it's definitely something great to explore.
If you could do any other creative art besides what you're currently doing, what would that be and why?
I've always been interested in photography. I remember because I like in high school, I took a photography class, and we did the whole darkroom process, and that was really interesting. And just seeing the photograph, come alive in the final process in the chemicals. I've written a couple poems about that, because I have a poem, in my chapbook, Hello, Universe Lovers, where a boy who lives on a Kansas farm, and he's kind of in a restrictive family situation, but he takes photographs of the cosmos and just all the stars, and then goes into his dark room where he finds his own seclusion and happiness, and it's his own space. And then the photographs and the stars in this case come alive for him. but yeah, I've always admired that, just that whole development.
I think there's a lot of connections between poetry and photography as well.
Well, I mean, that definitely takes a lot of skill, and in how. Oh yeah, that was at Baker. Yeah, Baker. I took a history of photography class actually, and for a while, like, photography had to fight for a right to be considered an art. Like, for in the beginning of the history of photography, people thought it was like, you would just like take a photo, like where's this. People at first didn't really see the skill in photography, and then yeah, maybe in sometimes when someone reads a poem, even like a haiku or, something really short, you're like, well, where's the skill in that? But there is skill. It might not be, always readily apparent at first glance, but it's, something where the longer time you spend with it, the more apparent the skill can become.
What's one thing that you wish you had known when you first started your poetry journey?
I mean, failure is a big part of it, and rejection. I I mean, I'll like I've gotten chapbooks published and some poems in literary journals, but I use submittable.com a lot, because submittable is kind of like the big mammoth in the publishing world, and I think I like looking sometimes. It sort of makes me feel good in a way, in a weird way. But I think I have around 950 or 1,000 rejections in my submittable account. So yeah, I mean, that's just part of the game. Just over the years, like in the past 8 years, I've been submitting on a regular basis. And I never take it personally, because they're just rejecting maybe a handful of poems that I publish. They're not rejecting me as a person, but rejection is just part of the game when it comes to poetry, and really any creative pursuit.
Very true. I think we all have to really have such drive that, like you said, we can separate ourselves so that we're not taking the rejection personally. Sometimes it's just timing. Maybe they have too many poems about XYZ
Oh yeah,
subject.
definitely. A couple months ago, I co-hosted a workshop about, it was like how to submit your poetry, and we went through a list of all the whole process, and yeah, and I talked about that, how there are aspects beyond one's control, and in that could be it, like, quality is part of it, but there's also a lot of other tangibles going on. So it's if one is rejected, I just move on. I'm like, okay, I'll just move on.
What would you say is the biggest takeaway of your time with poetry so far? Like the biggest lesson you've learned?
I think learning about the different forms of poetry. So I feel like have had different eye-opening experiences when I first learned. Like, I remember at San Francisco State, like, I first learned like what a pantoum is, and I kind of went through a pantoum fad in my life where I was just trying to write a lot of pantoums, and then so learning about all the different forms of in poetry is, and then learning about prose poetry and certainly free verse. But yeah, I think that there's a misconception that people think that poetry is all free verse, and I like I really vehemently disagree with that, or I like to dispel that conception, because there's so many different things that fall under the umbrella that is poetry. So you can just pick so many different ways to express what you want to say.
Yeah, there's definitely a form of expression out there for everyone.
And how the form should fit the content. So ideally, yeah, like if one writes a poem as a villanelle, the content should be a reflection back on the villanelle form. So like it makes sense for what the poem is talking about. So if you took that poem out of the villanelle and tried to write it as a free verse, it would be a lesser poem. And so I think I've gotten the sense that maybe some poets are not as knowledgeable about all the different forms in poetry and prose poetry, and I think one is kind of hamstrung themselves when they don't know about all the breadth of different types of poetry out there. And so like you're like, oh, if I try writing this as a as a tanka, for example, then you could write an entirely new and interesting poem than if you were only writing it as a free verse, and then when you explore those different forms, it can just open up a whole new realms of possibilities.
It sounds like having all those options is really inspiring for your work. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what keeps it interesting for me. I would say right now, like I don't have a desire to be, like a formal like prose writer, like writing short stories or novels. But because I just like exploring all the different ways that I can write a poem, basically. So like, and if I kind of sense that maybe I've been writing a lot of free verse poems as of late, I should write to switch it up and do something else. And there's lots of ways I can go about doing that.
What do you say inspires you the most? Obviously, not just the variety of the poetry styles. What subjects or what things inspire you the most when you write?
I mean, reading is inherently important. I mean, I think when talking to a poet, you can ask them, like, what are you writing? But I think right after that, like 1B should be like, what are you reading? Because writing and reading so much, feed back into each other. And I've gotten so much inspiration from just reading different types of poetry. And yeah, like I remember when I was at Emerson College, I read Albert Goldbar's collection, Budget Travel Through Space and Time, where he makes these connections so he starts out with one central idea at the beginning of the poem, and then that makes him think of another topic, and then that makes him think of another topic. And so it's this associative poetry. And so when I read that, like I was like, I didn't know you could do that in poetry. And so like I tried to write poetry in that way. I recently read, it's called the Rented Altar by Lauren Barry. It's from CNR Press. Well, I think I'm kind of biased for it because the Still Human collection, I was trying to write a series of narratively linked poems, so where there's like characters come back on a regular basis and you sort of can track these characters over a series of poems. And in that book by Lauren Barry, she's doing something similar with a marriage. Like she follows a marriage and the wife is the protagonist, and then it goes from the honeymoon to ultimately kind of a splintering relationship. But I was really love that book. So I mean, reading can inspire a poet in so many different ways.
And on that topic, are there any favorite books from childhood that have stuck with you and currently or have ever inspired the works you've done?
I mean, I still remember reading Where the Red Ferns Grows when I was a kid, and then that book made me cry when I was a kid. But I haven't read it since then. But that book definitely stayed with me. Yeah, that's kind of a big one that I can first think of. Yeah, just like the power that book has, and how it can bring someone to tears in such a way. It's just like the power of literature.
Agreed. Yeah, there's a few books that have made me cry. Not too many, but I completely understand that, the power of words, whether it's a poem or song lyrics or a full-length novel. There's just something about it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. And I still have some books from, years ago. Actually, I have one. It's called Toolbox by, I'm going to butcher his name. It's by Fabio Mortiabati. But Marty gave this book to me. So she wrote, an inscription for me from April 8th, 2008. Yeah, it's a collection of prose poetry. And it's a really interesting book because well, as the name indicates, it goes with toolbox. It goes through different items that you would find in a toolbox, like a sponge or a pipe or a knife. And then at the beginning of the poem, it has more of a wide lens view of the item. This one is file and sandpaper. And then you read the poem, and then it's a really close-up view of the same item. So like after experiencing the poem, you have a more immersive understanding of it. I've kept this book like for I think I'll always have that.
That sounds really fascinating. I may have to check that one out.
Oh yeah, I highly recommend this. It was published what, yeah, 1999, but yeah, no, they're great poems, and it's something, poems themselves, stand up, but then it's an association with Marty too at the same time.
If you had like no limits or no budgets on a creative art project, what do you think you would create and what would you do?
I would say definitely like to do a collection around historical poetry. I've written about history at times over the years, and when I mentioned earlier about Camille Dungy, she wrote a collection. Well, it was released, yeah, when I was at San Francisco State. It's called Suck on the Marrow, where it's persona poetry written in the voices of 19th century Black slaves. And, she did her research, and it really immerses a reader in that world. And I've always admired that collection. And so how I could dive into one subject, and there's historical societies, in states all across America. And so there's a lot of research to be had. And so I would find it really interesting, yeah, to write persona poetry with that in mind. Because I still go back to Colorado, like where my parents live, and obviously with Baker in Kansas. And yeah, I'm always found interesting the history of 19th century Kansas and Colorado, like bloody Kansas and everything in that regard. So I feel like there's a lot of poems to be had in that time period, but I just haven't invested the time or energy, but I think it would be interesting.
That sounds really neat. I guess I didn't realize that, there's historical fiction in books, but I didn't realize that, I mean, of course you could do anything, historical fiction poetry, so to speak. That sounds really cool.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I would recommend "Suck on the Marrow" by Camille Dungy. Yeah, no, I think that's definitely, call it a kind of a subgenre for poetry with historical narratives. There's definitely a lot of different collections out there that do that, and how one can combine, doing research, but then having some poetic license to infuse a creative voice into that subject. And I did write, this was like 5 years ago. I wrote it's called Kansas City Night, and it was published in a journal. Was it? Oh yeah, Ithaca Lit. It was about, well, it's a persona poem where a man is in a bar in Kansas City. Oh yeah, like on the Missouri side. And I think I had it set in the 20s, so quite about 100 years ago. And he's just in the jazz scene, and then he had been working on the railroad, so he's a blue collar laborer, and a poem can transport a reader back to that time. And if the poem is successful, you can live in that world.
Would you say you gravitate towards wanting to write more historic, or do you have a favorite type of poetry to write more than others?
I would say I like to write historical poetry, but it's something, it doesn't just come out by happenstance, where like if I just start writing, I'm not going to probably write a historical poem, because I would have to do my research and educate myself before I can write something in that regard. So the chapbook that I have coming out next year, they're autobiographical poems in poems about my family. These more realistic poems set in the Bay Area are all kind of semi-autobiographical. So that they're all poems that I didn't have to do prior research before I started writing them. I just wrote them and then revised them and tried to polish them as much as I can. But yeah, with an historical poem, I have to seek them out more, because I know the limits of my own knowledge, and I there's gaps there with regards, to Kansas and Colorado history. Yeah, so it's something that I have to be very deliberate about.
That makes sense, doing due diligence to the time period and things like that.
Yeah, and definitely to have a poetry that lives in that world, but also be respectful and pay homage to that time period. So there's another step involved for sure.
You write, a variety of poetry since, you're always expanding and learning and growing as a poet. I was wondering, how would you like to be remembered?
I mean, I think you summarized it pretty well in how I like to be remembered with how I write in a lot of different avenues of poetry. I've read a lot of my surreal poetry, at some like readings and open mics, but I don't want to be known as a poet who only writes that type of kind of weird surreal poetry. That's something I enjoy doing, but like I've written historical poetry, realistic grounded poetry that looks at gender relations. So yeah, like I don't want it to be known as one type of poet. I like exploring a lot of different subjects and in tones of expression, because like a surreal poem can have one type of tone versus a realistic grounded poem has another type of tone.
In your own words, what do you think it means to live a creative life?
I think being open to the possibility that an idea can always spring forth, and living one's life, one can always have the seed of an idea, just can happen whenever, and it's not always when one sits down with their journal or paintbrush or whatever their pursuit is. It can happen maybe a time that they're not expecting, but they're receptive to that inspiration.
Understandable. And that's so true. Being just open to what happens in life and finding creativity all around.
Oh, definitely. You don't really know what's going to inspire you sometimes. But that's part of the great thing about living a creative life, is that it can be so surprising and unexpected.
Along those lines, has there been anything surprising or unexpected that have happened to you that has inspired poetry?
I've been in workshops where I put a poem in a poetry workshop. The people in the workshop, are never attacking me as a person. They're just criticizing the poem. But it can sometimes be kind of tough, or like they're like kind of tearing the poem down. And like one time I was in a workshop at San Francisco State, and someone mentioned to me afterwards, they're like, I remember she said, they were kind of rough on you for that poem or something. I'm like, I guess so. I don't know. She thought they were rough on me, but I don't know. I didn't take it as much, but like, it's all about how one responds to the critique. And sometimes I'm not really sure how I'm going to respond, because I brought something in where I feel pretty good about, and then a group of like-minded poets read it and just tear it apart. Like, what are you going to do from there? I think when I'm successful, I respond in a way where I can elevate the poem to a level that I feel good about. That I have to kind of take a step back and have time to myself and think about all the criticism and accept what I want and reject what I don't want. And so it's a process, and sometimes I'm not really sure what the final product is going to be.
Yeah, it's definitely all part of that creative process, and so important growing and moving forward as artists, to recognize and understand the different kinds of feelings we have when we're criticized, when our work is criticized, and going forward. I remember, taking the poetry workshop class with you in undergrad, and as difficult as it was to hear criticism sometimes, hearing criticisms from the music realm, from like music lessons, was actually harder. So like by the time I got to poetry workshop, it was like nothing. I felt like I could survive anything, since I survived like music criticisms. And I'm sure, vice versa, if someone who was in writing and suddenly they went to go take like a music lesson, they'd probably be like, oh, this criticism is a piece of cake because I survived a writing criticism.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that that's a great attitude to have. I've talked to some poets, and I feel really disheartened when there are some poets who I know and where they felt discouraged, like they didn't want to write more poetry because they kind of went through the workshop kind of grind where they got their poem got torn apart, and then they just felt discouraged, and then they don't want to write more. So yeah, that's really unfortunate, because you want the opposite, obviously. You want someone to be like, okay, how can I make this better? And that's what I've always, the attitude I've always tried to have is, I'm like, okay, like that was a lot of criticism, but now what can I do about it?
Yeah, and that's a really good attitude to have, like how can I make this better? How can I grow as an artist, instead of thinking like, oh, they tore me down, thinking like, oh, okay, they helped find the weaknesses so that I can strengthen this work of art.
Yeah, definitely.
And on the opposite end of the spectrum there, is there a time that you felt most happy with your poetry?
I mean, last year was exciting. Where I mean, I didn't plan it this way, but I had my two chapbooks come out within about like 2 weeks of each other, so that was cool. Like one came out May 15th, 2020, and then the other one came out on June 1st. It's just kind of worked out that way, but that was, it felt satisfying.
And that's such a wonderful accomplishment too, even having just one out, but the fact that you had two and you've got more projects coming down the pike.
Yeah, no, it felt really good. And I felt like I had been building up to that for a lot of years. And it was all where I I had a lot of development, certainly in undergrad and then grad school. And then I remember, I think it was around after grad school, I didn't always have the feeling like if after I wrote a poem, I would still want the approval of a workshop leader to like say that this poem is good. Yeah, like when I was at San Francisco State and Emerson College, I would write him like, I think it's good, but I don't really know that it's good. And then a few years after I finished, I felt like a switch kind of clicked in my head. I felt like I had a better sense for like after I wrote something that I could kind of judge it in a way where like, okay, this is good, or no, this needs more work. But at that point, I felt like I could be my own critique or my own critic. Yeah, and then from there, I felt like the chapbooks follow in a way. It's kind of natural progression.
Before we go, what are some of the best resources that you recommend for someone who wants to study writing and poetry or go into being poet in their career field?
Grad school is definitely not necessary. That's what I ended up doing. There's obviously, with the finances and the time considerations, that there was, I think maybe in the past, perception that one has to get an M.F.A. in order to be a successful writer. I don't think that's true at all. It's one way to go, but not the only way. And so, you can do kind of a creative writing degree on the cheap where, you can take individual classes, like I've taken some individual classes like through the San Francisco Creative Writing Institute and the Writing Salon too. And kind of a blessing in disguise with the pandemic is that everything is on Zoom now. So there's lots of those types of classes available. I would suggest that one, read as much as they can, and not just in poetry, but just read as many in many genres as one can. But there's lots of great anthologies out there where, like, for like a prose poetry anthology, there's also one, it's a Golden Shovel anthology that came out a couple of years ago. There's a Villanelle anthology, so like those are great. I mean, I go to some creative writing classes now where writing prompts are provided. There's one, it's on Zoom. We do it on Monday nights. We just have an open-ended writing prompt, and then writers will write for around like 40 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and share if you want to share. That can be a catalyst to get writing going. And I know I've written some poems in there that I wouldn't have written otherwise, but once I was in the structure and framework of that, I wrote something. So I think there are opportunities out there if one is interested. But it's also in my website, some links. Like if those that are interested, they want to kind of help, jumpstart their own writing.
Sounds good. Well, Keith, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It was really wonderful to catch up and talk about your work and your inspirations. And listeners, you can find his work on his official website, keithmgaboury.com. And he's also has an Amazon page and Goodreads and a Poets and Writers directory page among social media. So all of those links will be in the show notes as well. And thanks and have a good day. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.